In the winter of 1944, as the shadows of war still clung to the world and human hearts yearned for answers that transcended earthly horror, a recording was secretly made in a small Virginia Beach hospital. Edgar Cayce, the man who for decades had been known as the sleeping prophet, lay in his bed, aware that his days were numbered. At 67, his health was rapidly failing, but his mind remained crystalline, as if the proximity of death had removed all the veils separating this world from the next. The magnetic tape containing these revelations remained hidden for 80 years, guarded by a family who understood the explosive magnitude of its content. This wasn't just another psychic reading or alternative medical advice that had made Cayce famous. It was something far deeper and more unsettling, an intimate testimony about the signs preceding the soul's transition, based not only on his visions, but on decades of quiet observation of those who were about to depart. Edgar Cayce had spent his entire life in a peculiar state between sleep and wakefulness, channeling information that defies any rational explanation. But in those final months of his life, something extraordinary happened. He began to perceive, with frightening clarity, that it wasn't just the sick people who sought him out who exhibited certain patterns before passing. It was as if there was a universal language of the soul, coded signs that emerged in all human beings as they approached the threshold between worlds. The recording begins with Cayce's weak but determined voice describing how it all started. During his reading sessions, he frequently contacted entities who had already crossed over. Initially, he believed these communications were exceptions, rare moments of connection with the beyond, but gradually, as he observed the behavioral patterns of those nearing death, he realized that there was an invisible preparation, a process that the soul initiated weeks or even months before the final departure from the physical body. The first sign Cayce identified was what he called the awakening of the eyes. This wasn't a visible physical change, but something far more subtle and profound. People began to look through things, as if they were seeing layers of reality that remained hidden to others. Their eyes took on a distant, contemplative quality, as if constantly focused on a horizon that no one else could see. Cayce described this phenomenon as the moment when the soul began to tune into frequencies beyond the material world, preparing for the journey ahead. In his own recorded words, he recounted how his wife Gertrude had begun to exhibit this look months before her own passing. She would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, with an intensity that went beyond simple contemplation. When he asked what she was thinking, she would reply with an enigmatic smile, saying only that she was remembering home. At the time, Cayce thought she was referring to her childhood home, but later understood that she was referring to a much more distant and eternal home. The second sign was even more disturbing, the calling of names. Cayce observed that people nearing transition began to mention the names of deceased relatives and friends, as if they were having regular conversations with them. Initially, family members and doctors interpreted this as signs of dementia or delirium caused by medication. But Cayce perceived a consistent pattern. These conversations followed a deep emotional logic, as if the deceased were genuinely preparing the person for the journey, offering comfort and guidance during the transition. He specifically recalled an elderly man he had met in one of his last charitable endeavors. The man began speaking daily with his son who had died in World War I, describing detailed conversations about how happy and at peace he was. What impressed Cayce was that the man revealed information about his son's death that the family was unaware of, details that were later confirmed through military letters that arrived months later. It was as if the veil between worlds was becoming thinner, allowing genuine communication between dimensions. The third sign Cayce identified was the urgent reconciliation. People nearing their departure developed an almost compulsive need to resolve old conflicts, ask for forgiveness, and express love that had been left unspoken for years. This impulse didn't come from the rational mind, but seemed to emerge from a deeper level of consciousness, as if the soul was doing an energetic cleansing before liberating itself from the physical body. Cayce described with moving detail how he himself had felt this urgency in his final months. Old disagreements with colleagues, harsh words spoken in moments of frustration, Grievances silently harbored for decades, all of this surfaced with an emotional intensity that surprised him. He sent letters, made phone calls, visited people he hadn't seen in years, driven by an inner force he couldn't rationally explain. It was as if his soul was instructing him to clear all karmic ties before departure. The fourth sign was perhaps the most mysterious, the lost time syndrome. Cayce observed that people nearing transition began to have episodes where they lost track of time in a peculiar way. This wasn't mental confusion or memory loss, but moments where they seemed to exist simultaneously in different periods of their lives. A person might be talking about their childhood with the vividness of someone who just left school, then jump to memories of their young children, and then talk about future events as if they had already experienced them. He theorized that these experiences were a result of the soul beginning to disconnect from the linear perception of time that characterizes physical existence. It was as if they were experiencing glimpses of the timeless perspective that characterizes the afterlife, where past, present, and future coexist as aspects of a larger, more complex reality. The fifth sign Cayce documented was the music of the spheres. People nearing the end often reported hearing celestial music, angelic choirs, or harmonies undetectable to others. Initially, Cayce thought this could be explained by auditory hallucinations caused by medication or neurological deterioration. But the consistency of the descriptions and the profound peace these experiences brought to the listeners convinced him it was something genuinely transcendental. He himself began experiencing these phenomena in his final months. He would wake in the middle of the night, hearing indescribable harmonies that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. The music had no identifiable instruments, but it created a sense of universal completeness and belonging he had never experienced. It was as if the entire universe was singing a welcoming song, preparing him for his return to the cosmic home. The sixth sign was the vision of bridges. Cayce found that people near transition frequently dreamed or had visions of bridges, tunnels of light, golden stairs, or other structures symbolizing passage between worlds. These visions weren't vague or nebulous, but extremely detailed and imbued with deep emotional significance. He described his own experiences with these visions as the most sacred moments of his life. He saw himself walking across a crystalline bridge that stretched over an abyss of pure light. On the other side, familiar figures awaited him, not only deceased relatives and friends, but also spiritual guides and beings of light he had encountered during his psychic readings over the years. The bridge didn't represent death but transformation, a conscious passage to a higher and more complete state of being. The seventh and final sign Cayce identified was perhaps the most profound, the awakening of the cosmic mission. People, nearing the end, developed a sudden crystalline understanding of their life's purpose, not just in earthly terms, but within a much broader universal context. It was as if all the experiences, sufferings, joys, and lessons of a lifetime arranged themselves into an understandable pattern, revealing a wisdom and purpose that had remained hidden for decades. Cayce described how in his final months, his own existence had become transparent to him. Every person he had helped, every reading he had given, every moment of doubt, and every spiritual confirmation, it all fit into a divine design he could finally see. His life hadn't been a series of random events punctuated by inexplicable psychic experiences. It was part of a larger cosmic plan, a specific mission his soul had chosen to fulfill before he was even born. During the recording, Cayce paused for a long time, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on an almost ethereal quality. He described an experience he'd had the previous night, a vision that had changed his fundamental understanding of the nature of death and what lies beyond it. He saw himself floating above his own body, observing himself lying in the hospital bed. But instead of feeling fear or disconnection, he experienced an indescribable sense of freedom. He realized that what we call death is, in fact, the moment when the soul sheds the limitations of the physical body and returns to its essential nature, pure consciousness, unconditional love, and infinite wisdom. During this experience, he was guided through different dimensions of reality, each more beautiful and complex than the last. He saw how souls evolve through multiple existences, accumulating experiences and wisdom until they finally transcend. The need for physical embodiment. He understood that each life is like a chapter in an infinite book, and that death is simply the transition between chapters. But what impressed him most was the discovery that the 7 signs he had observed weren't simply preparations for death. They were, in fact, moments when the soul began to remember its true nature and purpose. The awakening of the eyes was the soul remembering its ability to see beyond physical illusions. The calling of names was the reactivation of the natural, telepathic communication that exists between all consciousnesses. The urgent reconciliation was the soul clearing karmic debts to facilitate its ascension. The lost time syndrome was the return to the spirit's natural timeless perception. The music of the spheres was the attunement to the harmonic frequencies of the universe. The vision of bridges were conscious memories of the structures that connect different dimensions of reality, and the awakening of the cosmic mission was the soul finally remembering why it had chosen to live that specific life. Cayce realized that these signs weren't unique to people near death. They were natural capacities of human consciousness that remained dormant for most of life, activated only when material concerns lessened and the soul prepared to return to its natural state of being. During the vision, he also understood something that left him simultaneously humbled and awestruck. All the psychic readings he had given throughout his life, all the impossible medical diagnoses he had made, all the visions of the future he had shared, none of it came from him. He had simply learned to get out of the way of his limited personality and allow his soul to access the infinite field of knowledge that connects all things. This understanding brought with it an even deeper revelation. Every human being possesses this same capacity. The difference is that most people spend their entire lives identified with their fears, desires, and perceived limitations, never discovering the ocean of wisdom and creative power that exists within them. Death, therefore, is not the end of consciousness, but the moment when it finally breaks free from the illusions that held it captive during physical life. In the final minutes of the recording, Cayce made predictions that only now, decades later, are we beginning to understand. He spoke of a time when humanity as a whole would begin to experience these signs, not as preparations for physical death, but as symptoms of a collective spiritual awakening. People around the world would begin to see through material illusions, communicate telepathically, reconcile with the past, transcend linear perception of time, hear the cosmic harmonies, glimpse other dimensions, and remember their spiritual missions. He predicted this awakening wouldn't be easy or comfortable. Many would experience confusion, fear, and resistance as their old ways of perceiving reality began to dissolve. But those who understood they were undergoing a spiritual transformation rather than a mental deterioration would be able to navigate this transition with grace and wisdom. Cayce also issued a solemn warning. He said that during this period of planetary transition, it would be crucial for people to learn to distinguish between genuine spiritual experiences and illusions created by the ego desperately clinging to control. True spiritual awakening always produces more compassion, wisdom, and unconditional love. Any experience that increased feelings of separation, superiority, or fear should be questioned and discarded. In the recording's final words, Edgar Cayce offered advice that resonates through the decades like an eternal whisper. He said the greatest tragedy of human life is not death, but living without ever discovering who we truly are. Every person born into this world carries unique gifts, a specific mission, and infinite potential to contribute to the evolution of planetary consciousness. But most die without ever accessing even a fraction of this inner magnificence. He urged future listeners not to wait until they were near death to begin paying attention to the soul's signals. The 7 signs he had identified weren't exclusive to the dying. They were natural capacities that could be developed and utilized throughout life. Learning to see through illusions, communicate with other dimensions, resolve karmic conflicts, transcend linear time, attune to universal harmonies, glimpse other realities, and discover our cosmic mission. These weren't preparations for death, but ingredients for a truly full and meaningful life. The recording ends with Edgar Cayce offering a silent prayer, his words barely audible on the deteriorated audio. But those who have studied his life and teachings can imagine the content of that prayer, an expression of infinite gratitude for the opportunity to serve, a blessing for all those who would continue the earthly journey, and a promise that the love and wisdom he had shared would continue to flow through other channels until all humanity awakened to its true divine nature. Edgar Cayce passed away 3 days after making this recording in January 1945. Those present in his final moments reported that he departed with a serene smile on his face, his last words an expression of joy at finally being coming home. His 7 signs weren't simply clinical observations about the dying process. They were a roadmap for the journey back to our essential nature, a guide to discovering that we are far more than our physical bodies, our limited minds, or our temporary circumstances. We are eternal souls temporarily wearing flesh suits, infinite consciousness experiencing itself through finite perspectives, unconditional love learning about itself through the contrast of illusory separation. And when we finally remember this, Cayce, whether in the moments preceding physical death or in moments of grace that can arrive at any point during our lives, we discover that we were never truly lost, only temporarily forgetful of who we are. Edgar Cayce's forbidden interview remains a powerful testament that death is not an end, but a transformation, and that the signs preceding this transformation are not ominous portents to be feared, but sacred reminders of our true nature to be celebrated. For in the end we are all temporary travelers in this physical world, carrying eternity within us, waiting only for the right moment to remember who we truly are and why we chose to come here.